Joining us now, Julia Hahn. Now, we haven't heard from Julia in a while. She's been out and about, and she had a piece yesterday in Breitbart News which prompted my query, my call, if you will, called Republican-Led Congress Oversees Large-Scale Importation of Somali Migrants. By the way, the same Somali refugee that came to the States and decided that he had enough of America, and so he would retaliate by attempting to murder innocent Ohio State students trying to find their way to class. First, he runs them over with a car. Then he tries to chop their heads off. Then ISIS claims responsibility and calls him a soldier. Unbelievable. Try to straighten this out, Julia Hahn, a senior writer with Breitbart News. Julia, good to have you with us, and happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us what you found out. I know I don't want to read your story on air to people, but give us a synopsis here in your investigation of what is going on with these refugees. What did you find out, Julia?
Sure. So I want to get into all that, but the one thing I want to say is I have to congratulate you because I think you were one of the first conservative talk radio hosts to endorse Trump. So
the first in America. Yes.
You really have been so prescient on this election. I think it was a real victory for you and your listeners. So I realize we haven't talked in so long, so I wanted to say that. And I think it ties into the article because one of the things you wrote about in your endorsement is how Trump's election would represent not just a repudiation of some Democratic policies, but also of the Republican Party that really has been not just asleep at the wheel on some of these issues like immigration, like trade, but also actively advancing an agenda that really undermines the interests of their constituents. And I think that's what we saw a little bit on Monday with the attack. And that's what the article sort of gets to, which is that under a Republican-led Congress, we had a very controversial and massive increase in the number of visas funded for Muslim migrants coming into the country. This is something that was done under Paul Ryan's omnibus spending bill in December. And of course, just earlier this month, you had conservative members of the House Freedom Caucus backing Paul Ryan again for his renomination as House Speaker without, any problems with any of the, his views on immigration and trade, which really stand opposed to about 9 in 10 Republican voters.
Well, they also stand in opposition to just about everything that Donald Trump campaigned on. I mean, the reality of it is it's almost humorous when they talk about working together because everything that Ryan believes is the exact opposite of what President-elect Trump campaigned on. But look, we have a representative form of government. We don't have a dictatorship, right? You got to get through stuff through Congress. And they decided, I would think, Julia, that attempting to topple Ryan, getting into this war, bad idea. So they kind of went with him. Then they name Ryan's second best friend in the world, Reince Priebus, as chief of staff to get the layers on there. But what is going to happen when President-elect Trump tries to enact in Congress some of these policies that Ryan stands in total opposition to, right? Who is going to bend, Trump or Ryan?
I think that's a great question. And I think also it's, one of the things you hear a lot of conservatives talking about that are concerned about this is, it's not just do you want a speaker who's going to, go along with the mandate that Trump was given, but do you want a speaker who's going to, twist arms and, use all of his political capital and message and, go across the country messaging on, immigration reduction or, on trade deals that benefit American workers or defending national sovereignty or Americanism over globalism, all of these things that Trump campaigned on, are you going to have a speaker that just, goes along with that and then tries to get, the tax reform plan that he wants, or are you going to have a speaker that really campaigns on those issues and fights for those issues the same way, Nancy Pelosi did in a lot of ways for a while for her party?
Well, it's hard to imagine that Ryan is going to fight for Trump's policies when he doesn't agree with any of them. Look, this is all conjecture. It's all so much political narrative. We don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, there's going to have to be some compromise. But from our vantage point, I don't think the compromise should come from the White House. I think it's got to come from Ryan. Otherwise, he's going to get overwhelmed in there. I mean, we've got, of the majority we have, probably 1/3 of those Republicans right now are on board with 95% of the Trump agenda. It's the other 2/3 that basically didn't back him, and they're kicking and screaming, and they got to be dragged along, right? So we'll see how that plays out. But, I mean, you look at these migrants, I mean, the Republicans in Congress have done nothing to stop any of it, right? Nothing.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that's so interesting about what happened, the tragedy in Ohio, is that, you have these Ohio Republican lawmakers that really just weren't interested in this issue at all. I mean, last year, almost exactly a year ago, last November, Breitbart News did an interview with Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan, who's the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. And Breitbart News, I think it was right before the Paris attacks, and Breitbart News had been following this issue, and your show follows this issue. If you follow the immigration issue, you've been aware of these problems. And we asked him about the fact that Ohio has the second largest Somali population in the country, and we asked him about the fact that there have been certain unique cultural assimilation problems that Ohio has had to deal with, and whether he thinks the number of importing over 250,000 Muslim migrants into the country, temporary and permanent, every single year is too high, and whether that number should be curbed. And, Jim Jordan's response was, in Ohio, wow, I really haven't looked at that. I have to look at that more closely, and which is really astonishing. I mean, we followed up with him on Monday and asked him, do you regret not paying more attention to this immigration policy? And, of course, we didn't get a response.
Right.
But it's this, and that's sort of one of the things that the mainstream media, the establishment media, really doesn't talk about, which is that, the divide between conservative and establishment Republicans really doesn't capture, a lot of these immigration and trade issues, where you have conservative members of Congress that really just, like members of the House Freedom Caucus, that either don't really follow the issue at all and aren't really concerned about the issue, or at least don't appear to be, and also members of the House Freedom Caucus, like, South Carolina's Congressman Mick Mulvaney, who really don't disagree at all with Paul Ryan's expansionist immigration views.
Okay, so let's break this down. So, Julia, we understand the open borders mentality, right? We understand that economically because this is the unholy alliance between establishment Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats want the open borders and expanded free immigration because they turn them into votes, right? Simple math. Bring them in, sign them up, get them legal, get them a driver's license, get them to vote, win. Republicans want it because that gives their donor base on Wall Street and the globalists cheap labor, so they can then make more money and then give that money back to the Republicans sitting in the House or the Senate. So the Republicans want open borders for the money. The Democrats want open borders for the votes. That's the unholy alliance. But when you're talking about refugees, Muslim refugees from Syria or Somalia that are not vetted properly, that we're paying $75,000 each to house, relocate, fly them here, the other amenities they get, food stamps, housing, etc., they don't really turn into cheap labor necessarily. So what is, if you're Jim Jordan in Ohio or any of these conservatives, what is the objective of importing in all these refugees at $75,000 each, many of them that can't be vetted, obviously? What's their objective?
I don't know. I think that's a question. I mean, I think underscoring your point about the Democrats, if you look at Pew Research has done studies on this, I think only 11% of American Muslims either identify as Republican or lean Republican. I mean, so to underscore your point about, for lack of a better term, cheap votes. It's been described as cheap votes and cheap labor. The Democrats want the votes, the Republicans want the labor. I think that's what it gets down to. But you raise a really excellent point for Paul Ryan, who's really concerned about, welfare spending and entitlements. It's really surprising that someone would want to bring in such large numbers of migrants that will be. And as refugees, of course, you're entitled to access to federal aid, as you saw in the Ohio State case on Monday. You get to fill a coveted slot at a state university that I'm sure a lot of Ohio students would have gladly have been able to fill and would have liked to have been able to fill. You also, as a green card holder, you would be able to eventually access the voting booth once you get citizenship, and after that would be able to bring over other family members through chain migration. So I think you raise an excellent point of what is the benefit, what should be the question. Barbara Jordan, who was a civil rights leader and the late Democratic Congresswoman, made the point, and she believed in curbing immigration to protect Black workers and to protect American workers. Her argument was that immigration policy, like all federal policies, the national interest should come first, last, and always. And I think that's the point you're making, which is what is in the national interest of our refugee program. And I think if you ask a lot of these congressmen, they really wouldn't be able to answer that question for you. But at the same point in time, they take no action to really curb the situation or change the situation in any meaningful way.
Right. And one of the things might be, Julia Hahn, is that if you speak up in opposition to it, you have the fear of being branded a racist, right?
Oh, I think that's absolutely a concern. I asked the late Phyllis Schlafly, I was doing an interview with her last year, and I asked her, why aren't these conservative congressmen talking about this? And she said, well, one, some of them, really just don't care about the issue at all, which we have seen. And then others, she said, really just are afraid of being called racist or going up against the media. And so instead they fight on issues like, the Export-Import Bank, where, there's really, nothing they're going to say about you that's going to hurt your feelings, or, you take on these fights that aren't quite, that the American people, aren't waking up in the morning and thinking about the Export-Import Bank, where as opposed to other issues where, Americans really have been impacted. If you look at Virginia, for instance, I think UVA did a study, and until 1970, only 1 in 100 Virginians was born outside the United States. By 2012, 1 in every 9 Virginians is born outside the United States, which is just a really, and UVA said this, it's a complete transformation of the state. And
Julia, repeat the numbers that you just said so these can sink in. Just go over that for everybody again.
Sure. So until 1970, which is right after Ted Kennedy passed his immigration rewrite, which basically opened up the world, the United States, the world to enter the United States, only 1 in 100 Virginians was born outside the United States. By 2012, 1 in every 9 Virginians was born outside the United States. And I think if you look at that, and if you look at the data, you've seen that's had an extraordinary impact on wages, job opportunities, overcrowded schools, and it's just an issue of numbers.
Think about that. In 1970, 1 out of 100 Virginians were not birthed in the United States. You go to 2012, which was 42 years later, right? 4 decades after Ted Kennedy's kind of open borders legislation, and it goes from 1 in 9. 1 in 9. So 12% of Virginians forget not being from Virginia, right? Everybody thinks, they're from other places, they come to Washington. No, they're not even from the United States. They're from somewhere else, right? Relocating to Washington, D.C. area, coming, many of them, to Northern Virginia. So you have this. Again, this is the unholy alliance between the Democrats. You summed it up. We summed it up. Democrats want them all to come in because they want cheap votes, right? They try to get them in, get them on some kind of an entitlement, and then they're beholden to the Democratic Party forever. That's why 89% of them vote Democratic. I mean, these are just facts, right? I mean, I'm not making this up. And Republicans either don't understand it, look the other way, they're afraid to be called a racist, or they want them in order to get cheap labor for their donor base so they can continue the spigot of money flowing. This is really the unholy alliance. And the loser is the middle class American worker. They're the ones getting screwed because nobody's looking out for them. Am I right?
I think that's what we saw this election. I mean, Donald Trump campaigned on immigration reductions, and he definitively defeated Hillary Clinton, who campaigned on open borders.
Right. So listen, it's going to be interesting to see what legislation comes out and whether or not Trump is going to stand firm on this. And remember, we've had presidents in the past that simply said, we're not going to take any immigrants in for a while. Calvin Coolidge being the best example of that. He just put 100% moratorium on it for a long period of time. So, look, we'll see what plays out. I'm out of time. I want to thank Julia Hahn for being with us. You can follow Julia on Breitbart News. Just go to Breitbart.com. It's always an honor to have you on, Julia. Keep up the great work.
Thank you so much, John.
I'll see you soon.